ideology that claims to fight for justice, but in practice, according to its critics, often ends up silencing free speech, undermining meritocracy, and creating a culture of fear. Tonight, we are going to dissect some of these points, which are what exactly is the core of this woke ideology. The second is what is it considered a nightmare from a libertarian perspective, and what can we as young people who love freedom do about it? To help us navigate this complex topic, I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker for tonight. Hello, Kak Fadil.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, Kak Fadil. So nice to see you today. He's got his bachelor degree in economics education in UP University, and he was also a vice president in English Debating Society Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, and also his work experience in Next English course. Okay, welcome, Mr. Fadil. Without further ado, please send time for Mr. Fadil to give a presentation. Now, time is yours.
Okay, thank you, moderator. If I may, I would like to share my screen. I hope that's visible for everyone and that my voice is clear.
Yes.
All right, good. So, full screen. Nice. All right, so hello, everyone. My name is Muhammad Fadil Asidik, but you can call me Fadil. As the moderator stated, I actually graduated from university with an undergraduate in economics education last year, and I became interested in libertarianism, and I've decided that I would like to advocate for it, and I'm happy to be part of SFL. So, wokeism. Now, I would assume that everyone here is some sort of liberal or libertarian, right? Because otherwise, why would you partake in this event to take time out of your evening where you should be resting? But I'm grateful for everyone to be here. And because of that, I'm sure many of you would be familiar with the term woke. Well, libertarianism, it's a Western phenomenon. It's a Western political, philosophical tradition. So naturally, um, it's something that you would probably encounter from being online, right? From learning things online. Now, well, with that said, I want to discuss whether or not this is something that can be something that's relevant in the Asian context. So in this presentation, I will discuss, let's define what woke is, and I would like to invite everyone to be careful with the words that we use. And second, what does woke mean by when it's used by people who are left wing in Western societies? Third, what is wokeism as us individualist libertarians and individual and liberals? How do we define woke? And finally, is this relevant outside of Western society? And how should Asian liberals think of this? And spoiler alert, the answer to that is um, only slightly relevant. And in fact, I have some cautionary words before using those kinds of terms. All right. So interestingly, woke is not just an internet phenomenon. Merriam-Webster has a definition for that. The first definition is aware of and actively attentive to important societal facts and issues, especially issues of racial and social justice. Now, there's a second definition, and Merriam-Webster defined it as something disapproving, usually used by people who are on the right wing of the political spectrum. Woke means politically liberal or progressive as in matters of racial and social justice, especially in a way that is considered unreasonable or extreme. Make note of that. Now, what does Wikipedia say? Don't worry, I'm not going to read the whole thing. But this is just to prove that this is an actual sociological phenomenon. And in the next several slides, I'm going to discuss the history of woke, if you will. So really, it all started with this Black American musician by the name of Hadi William Leadbelly Ledbetter, who warned his listeners to stay woke in the afterwords of his song Scottsboro Boys. And the Scottsboro Boys referred to these 9 black teenagers who were falsely accused of rape in Alabama in 1931. So this is the first instance of the use of the word woke. Now, 30 years later, another Black American novelist by the name of William Melvin Kelly discussed and criticized how white beatniks, which are basically the predecessors of the hippies at the time, used black slang, including woke, without fully understanding the full context and weight behind it. So this is just to illustrate that this proves that the term woke to refer to someone who's aware of social injustices and other similar social issues, they could be described as someone who's woke, and the use of that term by people who don't necessarily understand social justice are criticized, right, by these usually left-wing activists. Now, further, in 1971, there's a play called Garvey Lives by Barry Beckham, and including in the line, I've been sleeping all my life, and now that Mr. Garvey done woke me up, I'm gonna stay woke, and I'm gonna help him woke up other black folk. Now, this is a reference to Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican political activist who in 1923 wrote Wake Up Ethiopia, Wake Up Africa. So keep that in mind. Woke uh, in its first iteration really means made by black people to describe you should be aware of the social injustices that black people face in Western societies. Now, moving in the 21st century, in 2016, I guess you could say this is when the culture war is the height of the culture war of American politics, right? Now, there's a lot of discussion about American society here because naturally the term itself originated from America. So in 2016, Black Lives Matter, who I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, made a documentary titled Stay Woke, the Black Lives Matter movement. It discusses the social movement of the same name. And to be fair, let us be completely honest. Indeed, black people in America and other racial and sexual minorities have been unfairly oppressed, very much not in line with the liberal philosophies that are so popular in the West, ironically enough. So we can acknowledge that these kinds of political developments, what we call woke, are in many ways justified, but we'll get to that later. Now, interestingly, in 2017, this is one of the first times that conservative thinkers start to notice what woke is. One such author, David Brooks, a conservative political author, said, "To be woke is to be radically aware and justifiably paranoid. It is to be cognizant or aware of the rot pervading the power structures of Western society, that is." Now, at this point, this is where the term woke really became a slur or a pejorative used by the right wing. Republicans are crusading against woke, as you can see by the NBC News here. Now, yet lawmakers and operatives who spoke to NBC News varied in how they defined the idea, while others said they didn't know much about wokeness at all. So, basically people on the right wing are becoming familiar that the term woke exists, but what exactly does that mean? Well, when used by right-wingers, the term is usually used as a criticism to group together a wide range of topics that the right wing doesn't agree with at all. So this would include corporate DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion of people who are considered to be marginalized. It also includes LGBTQ representation in media. So you'll probably hear things like woke video games or woke cartoons or woke everything, right? Moving on, there's also ESG investing, which is an initiative to encourage certain sustainable practices. It has its own criticisms, but honestly, that could be its own discussion. And more importantly, cancel culture. Um, if you know anything about the culture wars of American society, uh, it seems that you can't go a week without having some celebrity being canceled for this or for that. And so, really, when we discuss the term woke, much like judging what counts as obscenity, it seems like whatever people say woke, it just used pejoratively, and it vaguely boils down to I know it when I see it, right? Just like that Supreme Court case, how would you define obscenity? I know it when I see it. How do you define woke? Well, it can be hard to define clearly, but I think in this presentation I will propose a explanation that would be satisfactory. Now, just to illustrate, it is at this point that the term woke has been used in full swing by the right wing to describe anything they don't like. So, for example, Ron DeSantis, who is the governor of Florida. Oh yeah, by the way, if my voice isn't clear or if I'm speaking too quickly, feel free to interrupt me. But thank you, thank you. Anyway, Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, introduced an act called Stop Wrongs to Our Kids and Employee Act. So that would stand for woke, very amusingly enough. And a lot of it basically include this does not allow Florida education to discriminate on the basis of race. Um, I don't want to spend too much time here, but if you can see, this is basically pushing back against the notion of what people on the left wing has said that white people or people who are considered to be on the top of the social hierarchy has been discriminatory. Ron DeSantis, the idea is that he doesn't want to do that anymore. He doesn't want uh, basically he doesn't want education to be biased by a left-wing narrative. Now, it could be argued that's just replacing it from a right-wing narrative, but really the point I'm making here is that there's pushback from the right wing, from against left-leaning people who have been perceived to have that cultural dominance over the past few years, especially before 2016. And most famously, Elon Musk said, now, as you may know, Elon Musk has a transgender daughter, born male and transition from male to female. And Elon Musk said, "I lost my son. Yeah, I lost my son essentially. They call it dead naming for a reason. The reason it's called dead naming is because your son is dead. My son Xavier is dead, killed by the woke mind virus." Now, I will admit I do not follow Elon Musk very often because I'm not interested in the sciences personally. But yeah, it just goes to show that the term woke just became included in the culture war.
Woke is
All right.
accepting.
This is just to show that this isn't actually just part of American culture, but part of the broader Western society in general. Now, here there's a quote from Ash Sarkar, who is a British communist and senior editor at Novara Media, a left-wing media outlet. So let's have a hear of what she has to say. I hope you can hear the video.
Woke is accepting that LGBT identities are valid and should be protected under the law, that woke culture is an acknowledgement that there are racialized outcomes reproduced through institutions in society, and people of color measurably are treated differently.
Right. So this is how a self-described communist would define what woke is. So, if someone would say, well, woke is just an insult, well, I'm sure it has been used that way, but there has been times where people on the left certainly use woke to refer to a specific set of ideas. And I think this is a perfect quote to illustrate that. Okay, with all that being said, how should we understand woke now? Well, first of all, when someone from the right wing says it, conservatives, Republicans, whatever you want to call them, they probably mean it pejoratively against someone they perceive as aggressively promoting left-wing egalitarian values, often emotionally charged, and it can be difficult for them to clearly define. Again, when you really push them about it, it will eventually boil down to, I know woke when I see it. But this is where it gets important, and I would like you to pay a special attention to this. When used by people from the left wing, they mean something different than the usual liberal individualist anti-discrimination. So it's different from what we as liberals or libertarians would say about, personal identity and discrimination. I would say that woke is the ethics and processes of socialism expanded beyond class struggle to include race struggle, gender struggle, sexual struggle, and any other near infinite number of marginalized groups as defined by intersectionality. That would be the more rigorous definition, academically rigorous. Second, something that's a bit more offhand, or not very laden with academic jargon, would be an aggressive push for DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion, usually based on the belief that outcomes which lack these things are indicative of discrimination and or unfair social treatment. I think that would, if you ask a leftist what being woke means, I think they would find this agreeable. Now, hopefully we've moved away from the social media buzzwords that you hear when you're scrolling on social media. Now let's move into more serious theory. Okay, so as libertarians, we should be familiar with the ideas of our political rivals, shall we say, our political competitors. So how did the left come to its understanding, right? Karl Marx is not the only person on the left, and certainly not the sole precursor of leftist thought, but certainly is very influential. So I think it would be beneficial to explain this. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with how Marx speaks about the conflict between bourgeoisie and proletariat. That is, people who own capital and people whose only way of surviving is by selling their labor. That is the proletariat. So it should be noted briefly that being bourgeoisie doesn't necessarily mean being rich, and being rich doesn't necessarily mean being bourgeoisie. The difference between being a bourgeoisie and a proletariat is whether or not you own capital. That's it. Now, usually owning capital means being rich, but not always, right? So theoretically, it's possible for a proletariat to be richer than the bourgeoisie simply because they have to sell their labor instead of, but not owning capital at all. But that's besides the point. Now, the point is, orthodox Marxists or classical Marxists, as as Marx himself described the theory, that in society there are basically these kinds of people. There are the proletariat, the workers who must sell their labor to survive, and the bourgeoisie who has the capital to basically control the proletariat. Now, of course, there are landowners who provide the space for these activities to happen, and there are also overlap between proletariat and bourgeoisie, who they call the petite bourgeoisie, basically people, small business owners. All right, they wouldn't consider small business owners as proletariat; they're considered bourgeoisie. Now, in a Marxist class analysis, there exists the principal contradiction of the proletariat wanting higher wages and the bourgeoisie wanting lower wages. And this is basically the class contradiction that they talk about, and this is where class conflict comes in. The only way for society to advance, and Marx advocates the advancement by the victory of the proletariat. Marx believes, and many Marxists, orthodox Marxists believe, that the victory, the march of progress and history demands and will result in the overthrow of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat. Now, Friedrich Engels, who is a contemporary and close collaborator of Marx, has argued that the proletariat really has no meaningful choice in economy. This is because the bourgeoisie hold an overwhelming, disparaging power over the proletariat. Because if the proletariat has a choice, according to Engels, to sell his labor, but it's not a meaningful choice because if the proletariat doesn't want to work, well, the bourgeoisie can always find another worker. On the other hand, if the proletariat does not choose to not work, well, the only other option is to starve, and therefore it's not a legitimate option, as Marxists would very often say here. Now, of course, a brief refutation to that would be, well, if you want to say that's not a legitimate choice, then any human interaction is not a legitimate choice, because if Marxists would believe that the only legitimate choice is a one that has equal power, well, if we have perfectly equal power, then the trade would never come forth, right? But I don't want to spend too much time on this one because it's not the main point. In any case, as after the end of the Second World War, naturally Marxism and leftist thoughts have developed. Now, one such development is by this leftist author, Kimberly Crenshaw, who argued that it isn't just about race. It isn't just about class, but it's also about other identities. As stated, when intersectionality, we'll start here, is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. And further, when feminism does not explicitly oppose racism, and when anti-racism does not incorporate opposition to patriarchy, race, and gender politics, it often ends up being antagonistic to each other and both interests lose. So what does she mean by that? Well, let's take a look here. So both of these graphs here basically explain how intersectionalists expand the analysis of class struggle. So for Marxists, the primary class struggle is between in wealth, right? Well, not necessarily wealth, but rather the ownership of capital. Rich people, or more accurately, the bourgeoisie, people who own capital, and maybe the petite bourgeoisie, these are the middle class, people who may own some capital, but ultimately still work on their own, or maybe not as powerful as the rich, and eventually the proletariat, people who are considered to be poor because they don't have capital. Now, Kimberly Crenshaw would argue, actually, the oppression isn't just about class, it's about all these things. So obviously, this wheel of power and privilege is basically applicable to Western societies, right? The more you are at the center, the more you have power. The further you are from the center, the less you have power. So obviously, in Western society, the more you speak English, the more you are a cisgender man, you are a citizen, white. So basically, all these things. The more you have these things, the more you are powerful. The farther you are from these categories, then the less powerful you are. Now, there's also the fabric of oppression and impacted groups. The idea here is that if you have the characteristics of all these things above, then you don't have a cage, right? But the more that you hold these characteristics when it comes to gender, race, socioeconomic class, religion, ability, sexual orientation, the more that you are all of these things at the bottom, well, you have a cage around you. The idea is the characteristics that you have make it such that it enforces the oppression that you experience. That's the idea of intersectionality. And I think there is some merit to it. But moving forward, you see, both Marxists and intersectionalists disagree with each other on a fundamental level. Both of them dispute one another on the nature of oppression. So here's a public here's an online publication called Historical Materialism. As you can tell, this is a left-wing publication, Intersectionality and Marxism. Now, I would like you to read along with me here. In the first place, intersectionality theories allege that Marxists reduce all social, political, and cultural economic antagonisms to class. And some Marxist theories do, in fact, omit any significant discussions of race, gender, sexuality from their work, as Marx's own Capital did. Explaining the process of capital accumulation, crisis, and dispossession in gender and race-blind terms, or discuss axes of oppression, but only as epiphenomena of class, or secondary to class, that is. This erasure of race, gender, and sexuality as relevant terms in discussion of oppression is one tendency that intersectionality theorists, as well as feminists, generally have identified as serious limitation of the tradition of Marxism. In fact, it was due to the long history of the exclusion of women's work, lives, and experiences of violence and exploitation that Marxist feminists critiqued more mainstream discussions of capitalist economy and culture. So that was quite a mouthful, but really, the difference is that for orthodox Marxists, classical Marxists, they have this slogan called "No war but class war." Well, originally it meant that workers of each nation shouldn't support or participate in the wars of the empires or nations that they live in. The only war they should participate in is class war, right? The war between the proletariat and bourgeoisie. But actually, in recent years, in recent times, it has been developed to mean, hey, you intersectionalists shouldn't be doing this sort of thing. The only struggle that matters is class war, because once we win the class war, according to the classical Marxists, then the other kinds of oppression will necessarily dissolve. On the other hand, the intersectionalists will argue, hey, actually you can't do that because we as humans aren't just defined by class, we're defined by all these sorts of things, right? Language, gender, citizenship, education, ability, sexuality, all those sorts of stuff. And so intersectionalists would argue the struggle for all these characteristics are just as important as the struggle of class. So there you go. There's a lot of diversity of thoughts in leftist philosophy too, as can be expected, of course. But this is just one of those things that I find very interesting.
What I want.
Okay, now then, whoops.
What I want.
Okay, so now that you've heard all of this, maybe you might be thinking, okay, so doesn't that mean woke is just being anti-discrimination? And certainly we as liberals should be opposed to that. We're individualists after all. We believe in the equality of opportunity. We believe in certain inalienable rights. So you might be thinking, well, isn't woke just being anti-discrimination? If that's the case, why do we have a different term for it? Well, I will point out what exactly makes anti-discrimination not just that anymore, but it also means woke. There's something in the chat here. Freedom versus equality. Yes, exactly. So I will show this.
What I want at an interpersonal level is understanding, empathy, and solidarity. And at a political level, I want the pursuit of redistributive goals, whether that's power, whether that's wealth, whether that's land, in order to pursue aims of social justice along class, gender, and race lines.
Okay, so that's what makes it different. People who would self-describe as woke, of course, these days they don't use it anymore because it's a slur now. Usually left-wingers rarely ever call themselves woke anymore. The same way people usually don't call themselves social justice warriors anymore. It became an insult, right? So nobody usually self-identify as that. But before it became an insult, for people who would proudly call themselves woke, this is what they really mean. They want redistributive goals. They believe that inequalities that exist in society are injustices that needs to be remedied by policies and state power. And of course, as we know, state power is coercive and forceful and indeed an initiation of violence. So, with all this said, what are we to do as liberals? I propose that as liberals, we should firmly commit to individualism. Now, I would like to point out a quote, one of my favorite quotes by Ayn Rand. This is quite the banger. The smallest minority on earth is the individual. Those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be defenders of minorities. Now, of course, Ayn Rand herself is very strict with her philosophy. She has famously denounced libertarianism and insisted on her own political her own very specific brand of political philosophy, and her complete philosophy in general, that is objectivism. But as liberals, we find this very agreeable, of course. The smallest minority on earth is indeed the individual, and we hold individual rights in very high regard. And to elaborate on that, to emphasize on the nature of rights, again, by Ayn Rand, individual rights are not subject to a public vote. A majority has no right to vote away the rights of a minority. Now, the political function of rights is precisely to protect minorities from the oppression by majorities. And again, the smallest minority on earth is the individual. So, this may be controversial to some people, but I would like to remind everyone that rights are not democratic. Okay? People can't just come to your home, hold a vote, and say, hey, this house belongs to us now. Nonsense. That would be robbery. That would be burglary. That would be a violation of your rights. Rights are not democratic. Even as controversial as this statement may sound, but that's the point, right? If rights are democratic, then they can be taken away by votes. Now, I would like to remind everyone, what are the core principles of liberal individualism that we should espouse instead of being woke? Individual sovereignty, the belief that every person has the absolute authority over their own mind and body. People who are woke would not recognize this. If they believe you are a part of the oppressor class, well, your sovereignty needs to be trampled upon in order to equalize the playing field. Liberty, again, the right to think, act, and pursue self-interest without unwarranted interference from the state or society. It would be warranted if you commit a violation of crimes, but according to people who consider themselves woke, the fact that you excel in some cases, the fact that you excel in business, for example, or in other skills that make you, well, naturally unequal in outcomes, that would be trampled upon by people who are woke. They want to redistributive goals. Individual responsibility, the belief that individuals are responsible for their own economic, social, and moral circumstance. Now, to be clear, I do not deny that there is such a thing as structural racism and structural discrimination. I do not deny that. But to say that you want to, for people who are in the left wing, who would gladly call themselves woke before 2016, they believe that the solution to this is not individualism, but rather another sort of oppression, if you will, an oppression, but this time for people who they consider to be oppressed. You don't get rid of oppression with another kind of oppression. That's ridiculous. Individual responsibility is the key here. Now, private property and rights. Support for personal ownership and the protection of fundamental liberties such as free speech and association. Now, this is crucial. For people who are woke, they might think that the fact that you are of a certain class means that you are inherently oppressed or the oppressor, even if you don't actively participate in that. Now, that's an analysis that we can discuss possibly at another time. But the woke conclusion of this is that actually your property rights don't matter, because your property, if you are part of the oppressor class, the only reason you can have that much property is because you are privileged. That's people who are woke would say. Toleration, respect for the rights and others to hold different views, behaviors, or lifestyles. Now, at this point, it becomes comical. Again, for those of you who are familiar with the online culture wars, woke people who are, considered woke aren't really famous for being tolerant of other views. And finally, freedom of association. That is the right to interact with other individuals voluntarily. Woke people wouldn't agree with this. Again, they believe in redistributive goals. If you don't want to associate with people for whatever reason, they think you're being bigoted, and you should be forcefully integrated to prevent this sort of things. And in a way, that's what the Civil Rights Act is, right? That's another spicy one. I would argue that the Civil Rights Act is actually not a very liberal idea at all. But again, that's another discussion. Now, I would propose that we have our own slogan. Just as Orthodox Marxists would say, no war but class war, we, as liberals, as individualists and libertarians, should say, no rights but individual rights. Because, again, I would like to point back to this here. Yes, it's true that every person has their own wheel of status of privilege. They have their own citizenship, skin color, formal education, and all these things come together to have a specific kind of oppression for groups of people. Well, the logical conclusion to that is, well, the individual is the smallest minority. Again, let's say that I'm Indonesian. If I were to immigrate to America, there's a non-zero chance that I would be discriminated against. And on the other hand, there are of course other other minorities that are in America who would also face discrimination. Does this mean that me and that other person who immigrated to America would be part of the same class? Well, sure, you could say that, but if we really look at the characteristics, me as an individual have my own characteristics that are utterly unique to me. So wouldn't that also count in this wheel of power and privilege? Again, the minority is the smallest individual. And pardon me, the logical consequence of this is no rights but individual rights. If you really care about the minority, well, guess what? We as liberals care about the smallest, most vulnerable minority, the individual. Now, those among you who are probably more skilled in graphic design could probably come up with some sort of poster like this, right? It's definitely something to think about. Now, does this apply to Indonesia? I'm not sure how many of you here are Indonesians, but I would just like to briefly introduce what it's like in Indonesia. You know, again, wokeism developed in the unique US social environment. Naturally, it's not easily applicable to Indonesia. With that being said, there are some parallels that we can try to apply this to. Now, although discrimination based on personal and often immutable characteristics do exist in Indonesia, and one can certainly analyze with a Marxist or intersectional lens, woke itself could not be entirely fitting in the local context. So, so as you can see in this image here, to translate, it says, firmly reject the firmly reject the building of a house of worship. This is referring to a group of Muslims who do not want a church to be built in their neighborhood. So just as you can see, a US parallel would be something like not wanting a black family to move into their white neighborhood, for example. So you can see some sort of parallel here. But again, I don't think we should use the term woke, and that's because you can say that this is collectivist behavior that aggressively wants to address perceived injustice or oppression. The same way a Muslim might think, hey, I don't want Christians to live around my neighborhood, right? And you might say, well, that's just collectivist behavior. That would be woke. Yes, I guess that works. You can kind of use that, but I would avoid using these terms, especially since it has already been abused beyond being useful, even in its original US environment. What if a prospective reader, let's say that we make some sort of media post, right, to talk about these sorts of things, and we call them woke, and people will see what woke is, and it's going to be very confusing because it's American culture war stuff. There's a lot of like social background to discuss. So I would say let's avoid using this term and all the baggage that it has, and let's try to de-Westernize and simplify our understanding. Instead of woke, let's use the term collectivist and individualist. It's more boring, I guess, but it's better than just trying to use a term that's, yeah, let's call it leftist. That's also good. Leftism, collectivism. But I would also argue that Indonesia is very far from a leftist country. It's certainly more conservative and right wing, but it's still collectivist. But the collectivism is based not on class like Marxist, right? But in Indonesia, and I would say in much Asian countries, the collectivism is right wing. So that's something we should remember. Just because you're left wing or right wing, you can also be, both can be collectivist in their own way. So thank you for that input from the person in the chat, Fadhil Rizdian. Yeah, thank you for your input. Yeah, but I would argue collectivism and individualism would be a more accurate term. Leftist, yeah, sure, that could also work. But more importantly, it's bad because they're collectivists, and of course, as liberals, we oppose that. Now, moving on, why am I even discussing this? Okay, you might think, okay, that's cool story and all, but why do we care, right? Why are we spending so much time discussing wokeism? And here's why. I need a drink. Hang on. Okay. So, see, again, I would like to remind everyone, liberalism, at least in Indonesia, and I'm pretty sure even in other Asian countries, liberalism is almost like a is a bad word, right? In Indonesia, when we don't like someone, when we think they're degenerates or they're sinful people, we call them liberals. So in the Indonesian context, at least, calling someone a liberal means you're a westernized, degenerate hedonist. That's what being liberal means. It means you sleep around, it means you drink alcohol. That's the stereotype for calling someone a liberal. And it's unfortunate, really, because that's not what liberalism is, obviously. But we have to recognize that we're fighting an uphill battle against a conservative society. Let's see what's in the chat here. Indonesian woke right? Yeah, look, man, this is exactly what I'm saying. I think we should be careful with using these sort of terms, but we'll get there. Oops, sorry. Why is it? Okay. Yeah. So a few months ago, there was a lot of a big protest in Indonesia. I think that this became international news. And there's this influencer who tried to jump on the bandwagon essentially. And let me translate this for you. It says Charlie Kirk was assassinated. Ferry Irwandi, an Indonesian left-wing activist, received death threats. And she's basically saying, please be healthy and well for people who are fighting for justice and truth. Now, obviously, both Charlie Kirk and Ferry Irwandi would not be agreeing with each other. One is a right-wing conservative from America, and the other is an Indonesian left-wing activist. But, you know, she clearly has no idea, or probably just, or even if she does, she probably doesn't care that these people are contradictory in nature, right? They agree with different things, but she just lumps them in as if they're this sort of noble anti-government freedom fighters. Well, that's just not true. um, it let's be honest, this is cringe. This is very almost out of touch. This is very unaware of the full context. But on a more serious note, I would like to point out this post from someone criticizing the business of providing Hajj or pilgrimage services for Indonesian Muslims. And the title translates to the new style of capitalism called um, oh, sorry, this isn't for the Hajj actually. This is for Islamic education or Islamic schools. But the criticism in general applies. Again, the new style of capitalism is called um, Islamic Education Organization, and they're arguing that. So I just saw this title on Instagram, and I think, okay, why is capitalism to blame here? So and I read it, and it says they use poor architectural techniques or they use poor construction techniques, so the buildings are not structurally sound. Okay, but anyone can do that. That doesn't take capitalism. And furthermore, the lack of oversight. Again, what does that have anything to do with capitalism? Even in non-capitalist countries, there are also the lack of oversight, or even worse, the oversight is usually not in the favor of the workers. It's in favor of the government and the state. And finally, um, they leverage the virtue of self-sacrifice and religious piety and religious duty to get people to basically shut up to unfair practice. Now, I will agree with them that all of these things are bad things, but what does that have anything to do with capitalism, right? If anything, if we actually have a capitalist economy in Indonesia, then there will be more competition. There will be less regulation. There will be people who are able to provide these sorts of services, and they can do that by competing positively instead of trying to gain government favors or trying to have connections with politicians who can make sure that their businesses are not bogged down by all sorts of regulations. That would be capitalism, but this is very far from it. And unfortunately, then, for a lot of people, capitalism really just means when rich people with money do bad things in a market economy. You ask anyone who hate capitalism and you ask them to define what capitalism is, that's really what it boils down to in my experience. Capitalism, they think, is when rich people with a lot of money do bad things in a market economy. That's a stupid definition, but unfortunately, because we don't have a lot of liberals, the left wing can sort of can exploit and these kinds of lack of information from people who don't know any better. And unfortunately, what it becomes is that if you want to be political in Indonesia, your choices are basically right wing religious conservatism or being a leftist. That's your options. And frankly, I want option number 3. Thank you very much. That's why I'm a liberal. Now, with this being said, again, I emphasize that we as liberals have an uphill battle to look forward to. First, we need to get people to understand that being a liberal doesn't mean being a degenerate. And second, capitalism isn't when bad things happen in a market economy. Now, so those are my closing thoughts. Let us strive to promote a rigorous and robust liberal philosophy. We've got a long work ahead of us, but I want to do it with you guys. So let's do this. And that is all, moderator.
All right, thank you so much, Sidik, if I'm not mistaken.
You can call me Fadhil.
Thank you so much. Oh, okay, Kak Fadil, thank you so
Yeah.
much For all the presentation and a lot of new knowledge for us. So let me just take a few key takeaways for tonight discussion, I might say. So the first one, considering that the concept of wokeism emerged from the U.S. sociopolitical context, to what extent is it? Sorry. So the first one is according to Merriam-Webster, woke means being aware of and attentive to social injustice and African American communities, and was historically used to encourage awareness of racism and systemic injustice. And also, over time, work expanded to include awareness of broader social justice issues like gender, sexuality, and inequality. And in recent years, the term has become politically contested and highly polarized, if I may say. So, there's something about this, which is a different political interpretation today. There is a right-wing usage, which is often pejorative, referring to people seen as maybe aggressively promoting progressive or egalitarian ideas, and the left-wing usage refers to activism addressing structural inequalities. And the next one is about intellectual background. So, we have this Marxism or Marxist, which is analysis of power and oppressions, and also Mr. Fadhil also mentioned about intersectionality to include race, gender, and other identities. And also, there's a critics from liberal individualist perspective that's argue that political focus should prioritize individual rights, liberty, and personal responsibility rather than group-based analysis. And also the last one is the relevance to Indonesia, which is the concept of Wokeism. We know that it's developed mainly in the US sociopolitical context, so that applying the term directly in Indonesia can be a bit hard or can be sometimes misleading. So that's why this discussion of including Indonesia may be better framed using a more clear concept like maybe from Fadhil, which is the leftism, and there's also individualism rather than using the term of woke. Okay, there's maybe I'm sorry if there's any a bit of misunderstanding or maybe there's a bit of different context from what I get from this discussion. After this, we may open the discussion, which is a Q&A session. But before that, Mr. Fadil, can I ask a question regarding this topic?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So before this, we you mentioned about the thing in Indonesia, which is most likely um related to religion. So we know that in Indonesia, many social conflicts related to religion, ethnicity, and local identity. So I would ask is that would an intersectionality framework, as you mentioned before, I would say I forgot the name of the woman that come up with intersectionality.
Kimberly
So
Crenshaw.
yeah. Yeah, that's is that framework will help explain these issues better, or might it oversimplify Indonesia's unique socio-political dynamics?
Okay.
Thank you.
Actually, yeah. So I think intersectionalist theory do have a point, actually. I agree with a lot of what they're saying. I just disagree with what their logical conclusions are. I would argue that I go further into intersectionalism than the intersectionalists themselves. Now, again, the intersectionalists would argue that you have, as a human being, you have various characteristics, right? And in American society, the privileged position or the central position when it comes to religion is being a white, Christian, English-speaking male who is rich, owns property, slim, robust, neurotypical, heterosexual, and able-bodied. In Indonesian society, the wheel of power and privilege would look different. It would mean being a citizen who is not necessarily white. Skin color doesn't matter as much, despite what online perception would have you think. Yes, there is there is sort of white skinism, but that's not always true. In fact, before the year 2000s, the ideal skin color for Indonesians isn't white, isn't brown. It's something called kuning langsat. You should look it up online. It's quite interesting. But anyway, there's a in Indonesian. It would be a citizen who's of Melayu descent, who speaks Indonesian and speaks their local language, rich, own property, obviously. But instead of Christian, it's Muslim, right? That's what being privileged in Indonesia means. So yeah, intersectionality does matter, and it's very useful in analyzing social class and any society in general is very useful. You just have to switch it around so that it makes sense. Obviously, the privilege in Indonesia is if you're Muslim, not if you're Christian. If anything, being Christian in Indonesia is very difficult. Just briefly, I have a Christian friend who has been trying to get the same permit for constructing a church for the last 15 years. They already have their own property. They have taken care of all the bureaucracy. They're still not allowed to build their own church, even though it is in their own private land. It's really a hassle. So yeah, in Indonesia, being a Christian makes you marginalized in many ways. Now, just because intersectionality is useful here, I don't think we should use the term woke, because what I'm trying to say here is that being woke, or the term itself, is a secondary outcome of these Marxist analysts. So while the Marxist and the intersectionalist analysis might be useful, it is true that there are people who are oppressed, but that's not the only thing that matters here. And in fact, if we want to take intersectionality to its logical conclusion, isn't every individual their own minority? Because, well, both of us might be, let's say two person might be black American working class, and that makes them very marginalized, true enough. But what makes those two people different? Well, they have their own characteristics, their own traits, and that makes them different. And again, back to this banger, as Ayn Rand said, the smallest minority on earth is the individual. But anyway, to summarize, to answer your question, intersectionality can be useful, just like any political analysis. They have their own uses, but you can't use them for everything. Marxists would be wrong to say that Marxists would be wrong to say that everything is about the class war. Well, that's not true. In history, for example, the Crusaders, sometimes they would go not just to the Middle East, but also, or the Levant, or the Fertile Crescent, that is. But they also go to the freezing north. There's not a lot of money to be made there, but they do it anyway, the Crusaders. Not because of class war, not because they want to gain money, but because they believe that it is their divine duty. So just looking at history, I think Marx is wrong to just use that. So the point with that is, this can be useful, but we need to be careful that not everything is applicable with this. And woke, for example, someone in the chat said, in the chat of the Zoom said that there's something called the woke right, and yes, I can agree with you, but I would discourage you from using that term because, look, we already have a reputation as being very westernized people yang gak napak tanah, or that is people who have no idea about the practical realities of living in Indonesia. So I would argue let's not feed into that stereotype. The analysis is good, but let's not use the term woke. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Fadhil. Okay, next one, we're gonna open the floor, the Q&A floor to the audiences. So if anyone have interesting questions, you may also raise your hand and speak directly, or maybe you can type your questions in the chat section.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Fadil Rizdian. Okay, and also before I take that question, I would like to say, I would especially like to hear if there are any of you here that are Asians from outside of Indonesia. I would like to hear what you think about this whole of thing. What kind of, if you were to apply intersectionality here, what do you think will you have? Maybe in Thailand, for example, the privilege lies for Buddhists or whatever religious majority exists there. I would like to hear from that. But anyway, someone raised their hand, Fadil Ansori, I think. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Speaker Fadhil. Yeah, okay, for the presentation. And yeah, I do agree with you. I think the term collectivist is it's more better rather than we call it like leftist, okay, or something, because the both leftist and right, in Indonesia have their their own collectivist idea or something else. And
Yeah.
I want to like know your opinion, like a lot of Indonesian students, especially activists. Yeah, we can call it activists. It's like they like have maybe I can separate it into two groups. The first one is the leftist one, and the second one is the the religion pass. And I want to be more focused on the leftist part. We do agree like the right the right, like they have their own agenda to like some religion to push into the country. Like what the might be the factor, like there's no other alternative or other idea. It's only like if you're activist, so you must have like a leftist ideology or something else. I think it's really really bad to our culture, or specifically in universities as a student, right? So what do you think might be causes the factor?
Okay, so let's say if I understand your question here, why is it that in our academia, our universities' culture of political discussion? Why is it only just left wing and right wing? And how did it come to this?
That's
And
right.
ideally, what should we do to promote our liberal alternative, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I'm just trying to find something to illustrate. Give me like 1 minute. Let's see if I can still find that. Uh, yeah. Oh, here it is. Right. Okay. So to answer your question, again, this is a problem, right? With local context in Indonesia, at least. If you want to be political, your options are basically being a religious right-wing conservative or being a left-wing conservative. That's sorry, not just being a left-wing in general. There's just really not much choice other than that. And why is it the case? Well, if you want to be political, obviously let's say you're just the average student, right? You're not really interested in politics, but you hear the news and you think, okay, you know what? I want to try getting into this. How do I know? Well, his first exposure is social media. It's the news network, and he will see, okay, these are what counts as being political. You join a political party, and these political parties want these and these things, and they promote these values. So I guess if I want to be political, I have to be a conservative to be successful. But on the other hand, if they're really interested in theory, they might look into criticisms of these political parties, and most of these criticisms are leftists. So naturally, these are the only two resources that are available to them. Either they're born into and are raised in a religious conservative environment, which is, you could say, the default in Indonesia. Or if you really want to criticize, the only criticism that largely exists is leftism. So as unfortunate as it is, it really shouldn't be surprising. I mean, look at how many of us got into libertarianism. It's because we spend a lot of time online. We read things online, but not everyone can speak English and read this English material. So I think moving forward, we as liberals should be doing the heavy lifting. The very steep hike, the uphill battle that we face is that not only do we have to get rid of these prejudices about what being a liberal means, but also we need to give them the complete resource. Hey, do you care about society? Do you want to get political? Here's the liberal way to do it. And actually, you know what? Let me just repeat that. Kamu pengen berpolitik, if I may speak Indonesian for a while, kamu pengen berpolitik, gini caranya, dan ini cara yang liberal. Orang konservatif sayap kanan salahnya begini, orang sayap kiri salahnya begini. Mereka harus punya itu, oke? Okay? We as Indonesians, we can be liberals. Here's how. We don't have to be right wing. We don't have to be left wing. This is the option. Here's how you do it. Here's the theory. When they have that option, we can hopefully expect people to become more liberals in Indonesia. That would be my answer.
Thank you, Fadhil.
Okay, and in the chat here, there's the first person who asked before Cindy Justi. Akiak Johar asks, hi, if I may ask, what or how do we approach advocating for personal liberties, like the right to freely choose who to love, regardless of gender, in a religious majority society that believes the government should enforce moral rules, even if it's invading personal life? Okay, so now we're discussing strategy, right? Now that's something you have to discuss among your local environment. So basically, obviously, in a society that is very deeply religious, you can't advocate for religious liberty. You can't advocate for atheism. That's political suicide and probably literal suicide too, because you might get angry mobs at your doorstep or something like that. So be strategic. Don't throw away your life for this. Okay? There is a time for martyrdom, but that needs to be strategic. Don't just throw away your life for something that's not going to be effective. And better yet, don't throw away your life at all. We're not altruists here, okay? Now, what's the strategy? Well, start with something that's more not as objectionable for people, I guess. Yeah, that would be the term. What are the problems in your society that are not objectionable? Well, everyone has to work, right? The majority of people are working class. They have to work. What are the problems of the working class? They have a shitty boss. They have an unfair working hours. What's the liberal analysis for this? Well, it's not because of the Marxist analysis that the boss always has all the power, so they can abuse the workers all they want. Well, as liberals, as capitalists, we would argue, well, actually, that's because we are highly regulated. So, of course, the only people who can exist in the market are people with political connections. And because they have political connections, they can abuse people who don't have political connections. So that's how you get them into liberalism. You want to know why your life is bad? It's because the government gets involved. That's why. And don't you think that just because you have your guys in office, things are going to change? No, as liberals, we can recognize that the government, for the most part, will almost always be a bad thing. That's why we want to limit them. So that would be my argument. Be practical, be in touch with the common people, but give them a liberal solution that is principled. Okay, this doesn't mean that you have to doesn't mean you have to be hardliner all the way, right? You have to conceal your true beliefs, so to speak. And this sounds manipulative, but honestly, this is how leftists operate too. They will start with unionizing. Okay, that's great. But once they gain real power, like the Soviet Union, they become really violent really quick. And what I'm saying is, you don't have to reveal everything, but that doesn't mean you have to, that I would argue you should not compromise your principles. You don't have to reveal all of it, but you shouldn't oppose it either. So if you think that's not a good, if you think it's not a good idea to be open about that, don't say it yet, but don't say the opposite of what you believe in either. Just, try to steer the conversation into something else. Let's say, to close off the example here, let's say you have a friend who's a worker who hates his boss, and he argues, hey, you know what? I'm going to vote for this party because he's going to promise to make my boss pay me more. And then you could argue, instead of arguing, hey, you're stupid because you don't understand minimum wage law and blah, blah, blah. Well, congratulations, you've been very principled and honest, but now you've made an enemy in the workplace and everybody hates you. So don't do that. Instead, what you should be doing, yeah, man, I get you, but realistically, do you really think having more government is going to solve all of this? I mean, as a liberal, you should say, remember, the only reason we have these sort of problems is because the government gets involved. So, maybe it's about time we vote for something that has less government. Surely it's not going to make things any worse. You have to be strategic like that. And that's something we can practice. And you know what? One of these days, I want to talk about that. How do we construct a libertarian strategy for talking in daily life? How do we make people into libertarians or liberals? Maybe we should have a workshop or something. But yeah, that's my idea. To summarize, be in touch with people and provide them a principled and prudent liberal solution. Don't reveal everything, but don't compromise your beliefs and principles either. That's my answer. Akiat Johar. Yeah, let's change the society, but that's one thing at a time. Okay, Cindy Justy raised hand. Yeah, you're welcome, Akiat Johar. Cindy Justy, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, okay, thank you so much for the opportunity. I just want to ask something that I'm curious about. Do you think the meaning of woke in the 20th century is the difference from how it is used today? If so, how? And because in the 20th century, being woke was closely related to collective struggles against racial injustice. And do you think the modern use of like woke is still reflect collective activism, or has it become more about individual identity and expressions?
I'm terribly sorry, but I could barely hear your voice. It's very small, even though I've already maximized my volume. I
Oh,
think I
okay.
catch the second. Yeah, can you repeat that, please?
Or I'll chat in the room chat.
Yeah, that's fine too. If you can type it, that would be great.
Okay.
It's okay, we can wait. And while Cindy is typing her questions, how about anyone else? Maybe you have questions or something you would like to contribute? Okay, Cindy Justy. So I'll address your question. Do you think the meaning of woke in the 20th century is different from how it is used today? I would argue yes. If so, how? In the 20th century? Okay, so I'm going to answer the first question first. Yeah, the first question. The meaning of woke in the 20th century, again, it means being aware of social injustice. But for right-wingers, it means that's what the left wing means. And before they abandon the term, it means being aware of social injustices when it comes to race, gender, and all the personal characteristics as we discussed before. As for the right-wingers, it just means when people who doing left-wing stuff that we don't like, oh, you're woke, they use it as an insult. Yes, it's certainly different because earlier it means being aware, and now, especially for the right-wingers, it means being, I guess you could say, being performative. Certainly there are people who are performative when it comes to being woke, right? And that's just the consequence of having a popular ideology. People will want to bandwagon on it even though they don't know the full context. To answer your question, yes, it is different. Now, next question. In the 20th century, being woke was closely related to collective struggles against racial injustice. Do you think the modern use of woke still reflects collective activism, or has become more about individual identity and expression? I would argue it's both. Okay. Again, when a let me use this. Let me use this here. So imagine this sort of wheel, but actually, you know what? Let me open Paint here. I wish I have a whiteboard, but bear with me. Okay, so yeah, not now. Where's my circle? Okay, so in any ideology or idea, there's always someone who's in the center, right? These are the hardcore believers. And then there are people who are followers, but may not be as ideologically educated. And there are people on the outside, basically they're normies. They're people who follow along. So there's the ideologues, there's the activists, and there's the average person. Yeah, you could call them normies, I guess, but some people might find that offensive, but it's accurate. Anyway, so woke, right? Woke, when people use the term woke, it's basically used by the activists. Activists who say, hey, according to the ideologues, there is injustices in society. And what's it called again? Oh yeah, there are injustices in society, and we should be woke. Being woke means realizing that in this society of ours, there's injustice, and that's what the activists do. They popularize the idea, and eventually, when an idea gets popularized, the average person will also use the term. Oh, okay, we should be woke in order to be aware of social injustice. And realistically, not everyone believes in what a society believes, right? They believe that in Western society, the average acceptable opinion is LGBT is accepted, liberalism and individual choice. Whereas in Indonesia, for example, religious society, the only acceptable one is being straight and preferably being Muslim. So that's the norm. But realistically, not everyone in that society agrees with this. Most people, they just go along with what society says. So to answer your question, the reason I bring this up is just to say woke is still being used by people who are in the inner circles here, people who say woke in the real sense. But for the average person, yeah, it certainly has become a sense of identity. People who say, hey guys, I'm totally woke, even though they have no idea about Marx class analysis of intersectionalists, they just want to go along. They want to be the cool kid. And the way you become a cool kid in a leftist society, where leftism is at least the culture of leftism, right? And when it becomes dominant, you want to say that you're also a leftist, even though you have no idea what leftism is. So to answer the question, it's both. It's used by people who are in the inner circle to refer to the leftist philosophy, and it's used by the average person just to be cool. That's my answer. Okay. Rimbing Franklin Alfredo says, I'm glad I can help, Cindy. Yes, you're welcome. So, Rimbing Franklin Alfredo says, distorting history to be fitting into biased perspective is the problem. Yes, I agree. For example, I think liberalism in Indonesia not just tainted with Western wokeism, but also a new other era Suharto regime. Yes, absolutely, I agree with you. We've been established into religious right and left wing back during Sukarno era. That is true. And when entering a new order, the political establishment perceived it as Western intervention. And they started to generalize anything Western subversion. Ironically, Suharto wanted to limit Westernization to a large degree, yes. If he doesn't want to, he probably accepted any economical aspects that's suggested by the so-called Berkeley Mafia. Very important history there. Now you're asking, what do you think? What do I think is what do I think of these people trying to distort history to correct their political alignment and justifying it? Well, we should fight it. We as liberals truly believe that we have the truth on our side, because if we think that liberalism isn't true, that this isn't the best what we should advocate for, then what are we doing here, right? And to answer your question, what do we do against this? And you're right. There are decades of slander against liberal ideology as nothing more than Western subversion. What do we do? Well, nothing else to be done other than doing the hard work. Talk to people. And we need to be strategic about this. And I will admit that this is going to be something that's very tiring, very exhausting. Can you imagine having to talk every day trying to convert someone into liberalism without actually using the term liberal, because then people will just shut you down? It's tiring. But that's just the reality that we face. The leftists had the head start in being the anti-government. So now that's just, for most people, being anti-government by default almost always means being leftist, and that's unfortunate. So moving forward, we have a lot of work ahead of us, and I will praise people from Students for Liberty in Indonesia, and indeed the global movement itself, from trying to fight back against this. Now, maybe this is just me being trying to be arrogant by saying, oh, people who are leftists usually do this out of being emotional. A lot of it's true, but that's not because leftism makes you emotional. I disagree with that. But rather, people who are emotional, who want to just go along with the bandwagon, will go along with whatever is popular. And credit where credit is due. The left won. They won the culture war for the most part. Now, I would argue that's starting to be pushed back, at least in American society here, right? In American context, right wing culture is pushing back, and now they're back to being the dominant again. So my solution is, or my proposal is, we need to have our own faction. We need to have our own culture war. We need to have our own material. So when people say, hey, why do these billionaires who abuse the government power are being so bad? Well, the left-wing answer is, oh yeah, that's because they're dirty capitalists and they want to, they want to oppress you. The right-wing answer to that is, oh well, because they're dirty members of a certain race. I don't want to be too controversial here. And then because they hate our nation. Well, the libertarian answer is because they have unchecked power, because they can abuse that power because we allow them to. If we stop voting for the people who will promise to make things better, if only we surrender our liberties to them, that's when we have real change. And if they want real example, we can point out to Argentina, we can point out to historical examples where when liberal values are respected, society becomes better. And again, that's something I would like to discuss in the future, hopefully. Maybe we could have a workshop of how to convince your friends to be libertarian, or being liberal, or examples in history when liberalism works. That's something we have to learn together, and it's great. Sorry, that was a lot, but to summarize, what do we do? Well, we need to have our own culture war, and we need to start winning. I'm looking forward to it. Hey, yeah, let's do this. Thank you. I try to do my best. And if I may have some personal remarks here, how many people do we have here? 11 participants. That's not a lot, but I don't care. I want to keep doing this. There's this idea in objectivist philosophy by Ayn Rand. Full disclaimer, I'm not an objectivist myself. I have some disagreements on her metaphysics and her view on art and aesthetics. But the idea for objectivist philosophy is to loudly proclaim the truth and let anyone who wants to come to the truth come to it, and then we rely on them to, and hopefully we will rely on them to be the hero that will start to contribute in changing society. There's this article from the Mises Institute called Mises Institute Isaiah's Job. Okay, so the idea here is that, look, in society, chances are there are people who want to agree with you, but they don't want to agree with you because they think they're alone. They think, oh man, I'm the only one who's being principled here. I guess if I want to keep my job, I want to be accepted by society, well, I have just to go along with what society says, right? Well, we as liberals need to tell people who are potential liberals in Indonesian society, you're not alone. There is liberalism, and there's a good way to do it, and you're not alone. Come join us, and we will be virtuous together. We will change the world together. They need to know that. So in order to be the beacon of light of liberalism, we need to shine bright. We need to be uncompromising in our ideals, but we need to be strategic with what we say so we don't get suppressed or silent, so that the government or society doesn't silence our dissent. We need to avoid that, but at the same time, we need to be that beacon. Okay, so this is some encouraging words, if you will. Keep going, keep burning bright, and eventually people will find you. And to praise what you have been doing, guys, SFL Indonesia, if all of you didn't bother to have this, I wouldn't be here. I came here because I'm glad because finally there are liberals in Indonesia and I'm not alone. When I wanted to join, there's no one in Bandung. But even now, as late as it may be, unfortunately, I already graduated. I would have wanted to participate more in SFL when I was in college. But now that now that you guys are here, because you guys are persistent in being liberals, in being the beacon, I have joined you, and that's a good thing. We need to keep doing that. And uh, yeah, I've been very long, but here's something for you. Maybe at least for our current ambition or long-term goals, let's be like Neo Historia. For you Indonesian audiences here, Neo Historia is a Instagram account basically discussing history, but largely from a left-wing perspective. Many of the admins there are open leftists. So yeah, let's do something like that. And we're already doing something like that. SFL Indonesia is doing good. We just need to keep doing that and be better at it. And you know what? I want to be part of that. There's that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fadhil, for tonight's session. So, if I may say a little bit about our key points, more of the key points to our today's discussion is that we have to be aware of what the potential risk of wokeism to our free speech, and also there's also a critics between the equity and equality, which is the equal rights, and the adjusting income to achieve fairness, which is the because you suggest that protect equity may sometimes conflict with liberal principle of equal treatment under the law. And also, we know that before that you mentioned about we have to speak loudly about the truth, and we should proclaim the truth always, and also open our self and everyone wants to proclaim the truth. So yes, thank you, Mr. Fadil, once again for today's session. And
Yeah,
now
absolutely.
we're
I love to be
almost out
here.
of we are almost out of time. To everyone at Student for Liberty, remember the future of freedom is in our hands. Don't be afraid to think critically and don't be afraid to disagree. And never surrender to the pressure of conformity, no matter where it comes from. Thank you so much
Yeah.
and have an
If any of you would like to contact me, here's my Instagram.
yes, thank you so much, Kavadil. Yes,
Maybe you
yes,
can
you guys.
screenshot that. Yeah.
Yes.
If you would like to contact me, I'm always open to this.
Okay, maybe before we end our decision, let us take a moment to document this. I think,
All right.
Kavadil. Yes. Everyone who can maybe open the camera, please. You can open your camera.
Yeah, let's take a picture, guys.
Yes.
Oke, kita hitung sampai 5 ya kita.
Okay, count to 5, and then we'll have a screenshot. So
Ya,
turn on your
tapi
cameras, guys, and say cheese.
1, 2, 3. The second one, LL for Liberty.
Okay, sure. We'll probably
Okay.
have to think about that again because people are going to mock us and call us losers instead. We'll have to rethink that one, I think. But
Okay.
sure.
Okay, I think enough.
Okay.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Yeah,
Thank you,
I
everyone.
hope
Thank
to
you
see
so
you again in the
much.
future.
Yes, thank you. Have a nice day, everyone. Thank you so much. You guys may
Bye.
leave again. Bye bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Jalpa. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Tommy. Dan
Thank you juga,
semuanya.
Thank
Fadel.
you.
Thank you,
Kedepannya ayo
Fadil.
kita sering,
Kak.
ya kita kedepannya sering-sering kayak gini. Aku punya banyak materi, nggak akan
Oke,
pernah habis. Bisa diserapin terus ke konteks Indonesia.
ya, oke.
Let's keep doing this. Geber terus.
Siapa mau bikin event kontak dia aja nanti. Kalau topiknya aku buat gampang.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, I'm so pumped actually.
Yeah,
I have
so
to go home. Hey guys, thank you so much.
okay,
Yes.
hati-hati di jalan. Ya, hati-hati di
Bye.
jalan. Bye.